Okay, today's talk is called The Shadow of God, again. Um, the process of the death of God in European philosophy in the context of the Schopenhauer-Nietzsche lineage. So, we'll start with Nietzsche today, and in this talk I'll present how Nietzsche completes what I call a Lutheran atheism, and this will become clear as the talk progresses. So, everyone's heard of the famous phrase, God is dead. Well, this death of God was a growing concern during Nietzsche's time, and he wasn't the first to coin the phrase or point it out. It's a very common phrase that was used in various different contexts, some positive, some negative, some actually within Christianity, in particular to refer to the resurrection of Christ as a very almost paradigmatically Christian iconography. And so this primarily, during Nietzsche's time, springs from nihilist movements within arts and politics, especially in Russian art and politics. And this concern about the death of God progresses further on as Hegel falls out of vogue and factionalism arises within the later Hegelians, especially the young Hegelians. Nietzsche's own addition to this death of God critique is that Christianity is inherently nihilistic. And so Nietzsche's contribution to the death of God discourse is almost that God was already dead or destined to die because of what Christianity is. And so, according to Nietzsche, Christianity is a self-defeating system of beliefs, and this is exemplified by its history, going from Occam to Luther within the medieval era of Christianity. And later, Nietzsche also makes psychological and anthropological critiques of Christianity as being something that was born of a nihilistic milieu and therefore being destined to this development into a nihilistic worldview. And so, according to Nietzsche, Christianity is a morality of resentment created by enslaved peoples, and therefore is all about getting your revenge on the oppressors, and therefore its moral system is fundamentally a negativistic one, based on the drive to deny everything that the oppressor classes value, and to punish them through this new alternative moral system that promises to punish them in the afterlife. And so it's a counterpart to the morality of the nobles, which derive from the pagans as opposed to the Jews. And it is a morality that denies the will to power and will to life, according to Nietzsche. It's a negating sort of morality. And we'll revisit each of these points throughout the talk. So first we'll start with the death of God. There's, as I said, many different usages of this death of God concept. Dostoevsky was quite concerned about it as a Christian. He thought that if God loses the power of convincingness on regular people, then they'll believe that everything is permitted and our morality will become weakened. Schelling, on the other hand, thought that this dissolution of God itself is a process of getting closer to God. Feuerbach thought that we don't need belief in God per se to retain the value systems that were developed as a consequence of belief in God. And he says theology is anthropology, therefore we can derive our humane values and Christian values and so forth from anthropology. Max Stirner, he thinks that the Enlightenment did a good job of killing off and conquering God, and subsequently has replaced God with humans, and now we've become God. Philip Manlander, he thinks that it's a sort of a gloomy, pessimistic thing that God has died, and Schopenhauer and Hegel each have their own kind of responses to this ongoing death of God and the 1800s. And so Schopenhauer thinks that there was no God to begin with in the first place, and this is sort of this is a destruction of a mere illusion that has happened. Hegel, on the other hand, thinks that this is a very dangerous and terrifying sort of thing that has happened, and he begins his philosophical development initially as a sort of a theologian. Initially, he thinks that in order to understand all of the world, you have to go through faith in God, because an understanding of the infinite can't be procured by directly attempting to behold the infinite. You have to go through something else that is also infinite, which is God. But he eventually replaces it with his own system of logic. And now let's have a look at what Nietzsche really meant by Christianity being inherently nihilistic, namely that its history exemplifies the nihilistic tendency inherent in Christianity to defeat itself. So Scholasticism is a medieval theological philosophy that dominated from, I think, 1900s to about 1400s. So it lasted until the Enlightenment and Humanism. And the main project of Scholasticism was to reconcile Aristotle with Christianity, because the Christian scripture and the newly translated pagan texts, namely Aristotle, were the two dominant texts that were being studied by scholars at the time. And unfortunately, the guy who was translating Plato was executed before he could complete translating them, so they didn't really have access to much Plato. But they had a lot of Aristotle, and they were trying to reconcile Aristotle with Christianity, and they saw this as a reconciliation of reason with faith. And so natural theology becomes a dominant mode of the attempt to understand this God-created world. People go out into the world and observe natural phenomena and what really exists in the world, and then derive their conclusions about what God is like based on that. And because they're studying Aristotle, they believe that there are essences shared amongst things that people tend to categorize together. So when you see two separate apples and then refer to both of them as apples, the scholastics assume that there are essences that are being observed by the individual subject in each of the apple, which allows his mind to come to the conclusion that these are both apples, they both belong to the same category of things, and that this is an evidence of how God has created an ordered universe. And so natural theology becomes this very popular way of attempting to understand both God and the world, and as a supplement to revealed theology, which is just reading the scripture and reading the Bible, or hearing the prophets. And so Thomas Aquinas is the most important figure of this era. He achieves what is referred to as the Thomistic synthesis of pagan and Christian thought. He's a very strong Aristotelian, and he's also a great theologian, and he formulates a way of thinking that allows you to think in both Aristotelian and Christian ways. And so Aquinas starts with this model of the world and the individual subject, which draws a line between a boundary between God and the mind. Because the finite subject is finite in his reasoning, he can't know God directly, and so he must rely on the effects of God, the indirect effects of God, in order to infer knowledge about God, whether it's through reading the Bible or through observing the natural world, or engaging in various forms of logical deduction. For example, there must have been a cause to everything that has happened, except if you keep tracing it back, you'll arrive at God. That was one of Aquinas's five arguments that he put forth as a proof of God. And so the scholastics had this sort of naive, realist view of knowledge and how it happens. So there's objects in the world, and the mind perceives the essences inherent to the objects in the world, and reaches out into the world and comes to understand what the objects are based on the essences that are directly perceived. And then these objects are represented as objects in the mind, in the same form as the objects out there in the world. William of Occam was a major critic of this scholastic view of knowledge and metaphysics in general. He's a late scholastic. He comes in quite late into the picture, and he's famous for his Occam's razor, and this is where it happens. So Occam begins with this fundamental belief that all Christians have to sort of assent to, which is that God is infinite, God is all-powerful, and therefore Occam argues that if God is omnipotent, he is completely free, and a completely free being can't be bound by anything, not even his revealed sacred words, even the things that he's promised to the prophets, even the things that are written in the Bible. He's not beholden to that. So he could change his mind the next day and do everything the opposite as is written in the Bible. And because God is so free, he's completely unknowable insofar as you can't rely on any prior history or evidence that has been collected about how God has been thus far. And so even divine justice, and especially divine justice, is contingent on the will of God, which is impossible to predict for finite beings such as humans, and therefore arbitrary essentially. And so this leads to the horrifying conclusion for the scholastics that their study and science of God is futile, because God is no man's debtor. You can't study God, you can't bargain with God, you can't hold God accountable for the promises he's made in the past. And so God's law is seen now as something that is almost beyond human understanding, something that could be seen as completely incoherent to the finite mind. And this nominalist attack on natural theology via the nominalist attack on scholastic epistemology, it devastates the practice of scholastic study of the world as a study of God. Because if you're studying the world and therefore attempting to study God through the world, you can't rely on that knowledge anymore, because you can't rely on your knowledge of God in the first place. And as a reaction against this fall of scholastic epistemology, humanism begins to rise. Humanism is marked by a return to the ancients, especially a reaction against medieval Christianity. It's a return to the time before medieval Christianity. The humanists think that they have to recover scripture from the times before it was corrupted by the church and the universities, which were arising around this time in conjunction with the church. And so they begin studying Greek and Hebrew. They begin reading texts written by pagan scholars who are commentating on texts such as the Bible. And as a result of this return to the Greeks and the Hebrews, especially the pagans, there's a new image of what the virtuous man looks like. And the virtuous man is independent, heroic in this Hellenic and Homeric sort of way, great war heroes on the battlefield, and partly divine, also harkening back to the demigods of the ancient Greek myths. And this is reconciled with Christian worldview, because as beings with free will, humans are seen as delegates of God's will. And so the humanist worldview presents the individual subject as being cut off from knowledge of God through direct interfacing with God and the world, but nonetheless able to still reach out and still form an understanding of that world and of God, because he's partly divine. And all of this amounts to a valorization of the individual person and the individual human. And this raises the general perception of how much an individual human being is capable of. And Martin Luther is a product of this humanist era, and what he attempts to provide is a hermeneutics of God, as in the way to correctly interpret God and understand what he has written and said in the scripture. And for Luther, the scripture is the word of God, and that means it's a very special sort of text. It's something that allows you to commune with God. And this is a personal experience, and it's available to each and every person who does the reading. And you don't require the church as an interpreter of the scripture for the individual person. And therefore, every man now is able to become his own priest. And so this is very much in line with the humanist valorization of the individual as partly divine and independently capable. And as a consequence of this understanding of theology, he thinks that everyone should have direct access to the word. And in order to facilitate this direct access, he promotes the translation of the scripture into German, which is the common tongue, as opposed to Latin at the time. And he uses the printing press to not only provide the Bibles, but also do a lot of pamphleteering, which is a very powerful political effect at the time, because he's now able to bypass the church as the dominant channel of communication with the lay people. And so, according to this this Lutheran perspective about how humans relate to God through the scripture, even though there is a boundary between God and the individual subject, this can be bypassed or crossed over by the experience of God's grace, which comes from the reading of the scripture and the act of reading and communing with God provides the individual person with faith, which is what provides the individual person with the grace of God. And so there's now a capacity for each and every person to find a channel through which to gain an understanding of the world and, more importantly, of God. And so there are the three principles of Protestantism which Luther provides: sola fide, sola scriptura, sola gratia. And what he means by this is that salvation can only be earned through faith and through scripture and through the grace of God. And it's not something that you earn by doing other things that are seen as good in the eye of God, especially not doing good deeds or building good works. And this is a direct attack on the Catholic Church of the time, which had been selling indulgences, which are basically tickets for salvation. You pay the church, and they give you this this certificate that says you're absolved of some of your sin, and therefore you're closer to salvation and closer to heaven. And this is founded on the principle that good works can earn salvation, and the Catholic Church just facilitates a more efficient way of providing God with good works with which to buy salvation from God. At least as Luther presents it. It's a very vulgar thing to Luther that it's the deeds that matter, not the intentions. But Luther thinks that it's the intentions that matter. It's not the consequences of what you do. If you have good intentions, then the deeds will be good. Otherwise, Luther thinks that this opens up a way for us to bargain with God for salvation, and this is a mortal sin. This is a very vulgar and unchristian thing for Luther to do. And so salvation comes from faith for Luther, and faith comes from hearing God, and only God's grace can forgive sin. And because of Luther's attack on the church, and therefore an attack on the institution as the mediator between the individual subject and the most important forms of knowledge, science begins to flourish even more. Even though in the previous era, natural theology had become seen as futile because it no longer provided an avenue for coming to understand God. Now, just science in and of itself the pursuit of knowledge about the natural world and the focus on the individual subject and the human being as the medium of knowledge about that natural world. That's what comes to dominate after the humanists. In the Enlightenment, there's three major questions that people are asking. It's what can we know, how can we know, and what can't we know? And so it's about the capacities but also the boundaries of reason. There's two very important, the most important traditions of philosophers during this era. They're the rationalists and the empiricists. The rationalists are all about intuition and deduction. Their model of the supreme form of knowledge is mathematics. Many of the rationalist philosophers were great mathematicians. They did things like invent calculus, and they're all about providing geometric proofs for knowledge, attempting to seek out perfect, undoubtable knowledge. The empiricists are kind of the great rivals of rationalists. Their great model of knowledge is physics, and they are very interested in learning about things that are provided to us through our senses and our experience. And they think that you can't believe in anything except for things that are provided to you through your senses, because there is no other source of information in the first place. And they don't believe in innate knowledge. They don't really believe that there's an innate intuition that lets us understand what's out there in the world. And they believe that if there's any knowledge possible for us at all, it has to come from experience, and it has to come through the senses. And so the rationalists their general mood is towards a moral progress, whereas the empiricists are more interested in a scientific progress. But there's a lot of overlap between the two. And so there's a sort of a split in the worldview as regards to the individual subject's relation to the external world. The rationalists believe that at least what you experience as your own cognition is something that you can rely on, but not anything about the external world. In fact, Descartes, the great rationalist, begins by doubting everything about the world, beginning with external objects. He thinks that first we have to start with things that are completely certain, and what he ends up with is saying that we can't trust that the things exist out there in the world as we perceive them to be. We could be dreaming, we could be hallucinating, some demon could be tricking us, but what we can never doubt is that we're doing this thinking in the first place, and there are thoughts that are occurring that push us forward the pursuit of this skeptical line of reasoning in the first place. And then Descartes builds on top of this certain knowledge things like there must be at least something else out there that also exists, namely God. And so he attempts, along with the other rationalists, to build a mode of knowledge that is always grounded in perfect knowledge, a complete geometric proof about how much you can believe and why you should necessarily believe it. So reason can give perfect knowledge, but nothing of the external perception can. And the empiricists, on the other hand, have this opposite picture where they think that it's at least the perception that they can't doubt. At least something is being perceived. They think that it's uncertain how much you can trust our perception. So we might perceive an object to be a certain color or a certain mass and so on, but it's unclear how to tell apart qualities in objects that are inherent to the object as opposed to something that happens as a result of being perceived by the human being. So you could have an optical illusion that distorts the otherwise reliable perceptual sensory data that comes through your eyes. But they're also very skeptical that we can really infer much complete knowledge, if at all, about the external world. But they think that this is the only source of knowledge we've really got. Perception, the existence of perception, is all we can really know, and therefore we have to think about knowledge as something that has to do with the perception of external sensory input. But Bishop Berkeley, again recapitulating Occam's attack on scholasticism through his nominalism, also utilizes the Occam's razor on empiricism itself. And so for Bishop Berkeley, not even the independent existence of the external world is something that can be taken for granted. And so what happens through Berkeley is that he says we can't ever be certain about anything truly existing in the outside world. In fact, we can't really find any reason to tell apart what is more certain and less certain about the external world, because all we really have is perception. He argues that means that we don't have a place for external objects in our philosophy in the first place, so we should get rid of it. And the consequence of that is that Berkeley is forced to argue that perception is all that exists. There's nothing else in the world, it's all perception. So whereas Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, Berkeley says that perception, to exist is to be perceived, and therefore, he says, perhaps if you stop being perceived, you'll cease to exist completely. You'll just disappear, and you'll be as if you never existed. But experience shows that if you go to bed by yourself and there's no one watching you, you still wake up the next day, even though there was no perceiver to keep you being perceived while you slept. So there's something going on here, and Berkeley opts to believe that God exists, and that's why things that necessarily need perception in order to exist can go on existing, because God is always watching. And so Berkeley presents this strange picture of everything everything being pure perception, but not the subject's own perception. In fact, the subjects may as well not exist, because God can see anything and everything at all times. And Kant comes onto the scene as the rationalists and the empiricists are kind of in pitched battle, and becoming quite desperate, as you've seen, about just how much we can know, if anything at all. Knowledge seems like a very limited kind of prospect, if it is available really at all for the human subject. And the rationalists and the empiricists are kind of evenly matched. But Immanuel Kant, again recapitulating the Thomistic synthesis of paganism and Christianity, succeeds in the synthesis of rationalism and empiricism. Now, think about the scholastic theory of mind and knowledge again, this naive realism about the direct perception of essences in the world and the reflection of the essences in the mind of the subject. And the nominalist attack on natural theology through the attack on scholastic epistemology. Well, the scholastic theory of mind and knowledge essentially argues that the world exists independently of the mind, and the mind exists internally, but it can reach out to the world and therefore access it immediately. Kant draws a line between the world and the subject. There is the direct understanding of the world as it is, which is called noumena, and this is sort of speculative form of knowledge for Kant, and a lot of his project is preoccupied with the attempt to provide a means of gaining knowledge of the external world, which is called the things in themselves. And Kant believes that this is a rationalist form of knowledge. This is something that happens through intuition. It's an internal sort of pursuit of knowledge about things that are not in direct contact with the subject. Whereas the phenomenal knowledge, the sensory input and the perceptions, are something that are directly accessible by the subject. It's in the subject's mind. It comes in through sensory input. it's an empirical form of knowledge, and it's directly accessible. For Kant, the phenomenal knowledge and the sensory input and experience is a special kind of phenomenon in the world, because it's an overlap of experience with the existence of a thing, whereas anything else in the world is either a thing or something that is doing the perceiving. And so noumena can't be directly inferred or accessed, but it can be indirectly inferred, whereas phenomena is something that is directly accessible to the humans, because it is the direct experience of the sensory input within the human being. And as opposed to the scholastics, Kant doesn't think there are essences out there in the world, but rather we impose the patterns like laws of nature onto the world. But he doesn't think that this is an illusory form of knowledge. He thinks that there really are laws of knowledge, and this is a form of knowledge, and it's an important form of knowledge. Kant, much like the humanists and the Enlightenment epistemologists, had a trio of the most important questions that he's asking. What can I know? What must I do? And what may I hope? So he's got a much more deeper interest in this subject, and therefore comes to focus more on the ethics. So what must I do? And also what may I hope? And so it's both an ethical and an epistemological boundary that he's drawing, and this is something that Kant sees as continuous. Ethics and epistemology are continuous for Kant here. So the line between the noumena and the phenomena, it's showing, Kant thinks this shows what kinds of methods of knowing we have, and what kinds of beings and subjects we are, and what forms of knowledge are possible to us. This is very much an extension of the Enlightenment preoccupation with the bounds of knowledge, and Kant is sort of the Kant is sort of the completion of that, and he provides the kind of starting point for the post Enlightenment epistemological projects, which are still ongoing to this day. So as I've shown, the noumena and the phenomena are divided into two distinct realms of knowledge, but they're synthesized within the subject because things like empirical knowledge and sensory experience can start off the internal rational process of reasoning. The sensory input is processed by rational reasoning into forms of further knowledge, like inductive knowledge about what might happen in the future based on evidence in the past or based on logic. And so this is how Kant synthesizes rationalism and empiricism. But nonetheless, there is still a line drawn between God and mind for Kant, and therefore also between the thing in itself and the representations internal to the subject. It's exactly the same sort of difficulty as faced by the post-nominalistic scholastics. After Kant introduces this very firm boundary between the world and the subject, there are reactions against Kant and the Kantian bound between the world and subject. Many attempts to cross that boundary to gain some kind of direct access to knowledge about the external world. One of the most famous is Hegel, and he attempts to transgress this Kantian limit by coming up with a different metaphysics of not just the subject and not just the world, but also a meta-philosophical theory. Hegel reverses Kantian epistemology because he thinks that Kant's problem is that he is attempting to seek eternal and necessary knowledge that is not changing. For Hegel, instead, all truth and knowledge are contextual to history, and this is always human history for Hegel. The knowing subject is a product of the historical context. So not only is the external world, which the individual subject attempts to understand, a product of the historical context, but also the knowing subject itself is a product of that historical context. So both are contingent. And because the world is a product of the historical context, and so is the subject, new knowledge and new ways of knowing arise every time a subject comes to form some understanding, because for Hegel, the process of understanding is something that necessarily imposes changes onto the world. This seems very strange and counterintuitive, because we're used to this sort of Kantian way of understanding epistemology. But Hegel thinks that when someone comes to understand something, that the object that is being understood changes for the subject. It's like reading a book. Before you read a book, it's a sort of a mystery what's inside. After you read the book, you've finished reading it, you know what's inside. It's not the same book to you before and after. And roughly this is the sort of process of understanding which Hegel sees all of knowledge as being consisting of. And this scales into the historical scale as lots and lots of people in a society engage in new modes of knowing through utilizing the historical context, and also utilizing the philosophy which arose from that context to come to understand their own world. And so for Hegel, the subject is prior to the world. For Kant, knowledge begins with the external world. The external world is prior to the subject. The goal of knowledge for Kant is to correctly and accurately understand the world. For Hegel, the external world and the subject both change through the process of understanding, and therefore understanding is not possible without the subject, because the subject imposes understanding onto the world, because the subject changes things through understanding and through knowledge, and this is what understanding and knowledge is for Hegel. And for Hegel, history is this meta-philosophical progress, and what that means is, whereas for Kant, the goal of philosophy is the attainment of universal, necessary, and eternal truth through the exercise of reason and very rigid forms of rationality, and the full development and discovery of an epistemological system which correctly confines the individual subject to the correct way of attempting to form understandings. For Hegel, philosophy is particular to each historical context, and this means that a philosophy can be right for its own time and provide an understanding for its own time that is correct, but that same philosophy may become anachronistic and inaccurate in the next era, because the people are different and the historical context is different and the world is different. And so Hegel thinks that philosophy is something that has to always change. The natural world and the laws of nature, as opposed to philosophy, doesn't change. But Hegel thinks that is not the goal of philosophy. That is not what philosophy is about, and therefore that is not what ultimate, complete, absolute truth is about. Because, as I mentioned earlier, Hegel starts off with an attempt to rescue theology and to utilize faith, or something that's a substitute for faith, as a tool for understanding everything about the world, which he calls absolute knowing. And so to understand the absolute, the infinity of all knowledge, complete truth, you have to progress philosophy forward, and can't attain it just by being a singular, perfectly rational individual, because the individual subject is a finite being and is limited by especially his or her historical context. But Hegel thinks that incremental improvements across the generations over history can happen, not just through the development of philosophical conceptualization, but also the change of historical contexts and the world itself in order to facilitate better and more developed philosophies that can help us reach a deeper understanding until it eventually will arrive at a complete philosophy that allows us complete knowledge about the world. And so this is Hegel's attempt to ground philosophy itself. It's his attempt to show that this is what gives us certainty. This is what gives us the definite assurance that philosophy really does give us knowledge. And so his consistent belief, which he thinks is something to hold on to regardless of historical context, is a meta-philosophy, but the meta-philosophy is all about how to create new philosophies and why new philosophies are created. Whereas for Kant, there's one correct philosophy that we should be able to find if we just do our thinking correctly. So through this very elaborate maneuver, Hegel manages to cross the boundary that Kant has set up, not by giving us direct access into the world so much as allowing us some concealed, but I suppose sort of direct access into or through the world by acting onto the world. So rather than being able to perceive the world directly and gain access of the knowledge of the world directly, the Hegelian subject, acts the philosophy out onto the world, and the world responds to it, changes in response to the subject's attempt to understand it, therefore changes the subject, and this repeats in a cycle. And so since both the world and the subject are part of this historical context, they're continuous with each other, even though epistemologically there's a line between the world and the subject. Arthur Schopenhauer really didn't like Hegel. He's reacting against the idealists in particular, but he's also got a reaction against Kant that he develops through what he thinks of as an orthodox Kantian line, but he's decidedly not orthodox Kantian. Schopenhauer's got his own system, and it's got these three pillars: his epistemology, which he derives from Kant, and this is an expansion on Kant's methodology of knowing. This was his PhD dissertation. Terribly tried to publish it, didn't sell. His metaphysics comes from an Occamist sort of understanding about the world as this chaotic, unpredictable, and just incomprehensible sort of thing that is beyond human reason. It's unreasonable, fundamentally unreasonable sort of world. And his metaethics he derives from ancient India, and he mainly believes that everything from both the apparently positive emotions like desire, love, happiness, but also, of course, the pains, they're all bad because they're all things that drive human beings towards desiring things. And these desires are always bound to ultimately fail, and so he thinks that the correct way to do ethics is to focus on the reduction of the suffering. And for Schopenhauer, the world consists of an irrational and chaotic force which he calls the will. And this is a very strange kind of substance. It manifests not only as emotional and experiencing subjects, but also inanimate objects. For example, gravity exists because all objects have the desire to fall because of the will, which manifests as the subjects. As the inanimate objects and all other objects and subjects in the world. All movement and all tendencies, all activity and events in the world, especially conflict and frustration, are the consequence of the will's own frustration and its own desiring. So the will is a singular entity which has been fragmented and divided into many entities because of the internal conflict within the will that wants to access or attain different things. And so the conflict splits the will into many different things, and that's why Schopenhauer thinks seems to exist many different objects and people and animals and things in the world. And the more the will wills, as in the more its subcomponents desire and pursue its desires, the worse the splitting gets. And this is comprehensive. All and every desire results in this exacerbation of the splitting of the will. Whether it's the will to know or the will to pleasure, even the attempt to understand the will worsens this condition of fragmentation of the will. And all of existence is the manifestation of the singular will, and especially subjects are the more complex thinking, experiencing, desiring, understanding beings are even worse, because they can achieve more elaborate and persistent forms of willing. And because the world is the will, and the willing subjects are also the will is experiencing itself, and therefore it is imposing the experienced patterns, as in the splitting of the will, onto itself. So the will is to be blamed for its own splitting and its own suffering. This is very much like the Kantian view of science and scientific knowledge, in which the subject is imposing patterns of scientific regularities and laws onto the natural world, where it doesn't really exist. Except this is a terrible thing for Schopenhauer, because it leads to a literal fragmentation of the will, and so the subject's understanding, like in Hegel, has a direct consequence on the world. But whereas Hegel thought this is a great thing, it's a progression of history, Schopenhauer thinks it's a bad thing, and it should be done away with as much as possible. Because any attempt to distinguish between phenomena just worsens the fragmentation, which ultimately causes more suffering in the world. And Schopenhauer thinks that this endless suffering can be stilled by subduing desires and willing. And he thinks one of the best ways to do this is the experience of art, especially music. He thinks music is the purest form of art, and many of his readers, especially artists, very much like this way of thinking. He's very influential with artists. And he thinks that this is a form of... this is sort of a form of pest control. He uses the analogy of the Australian bulldog ant, which, when split in half, begins to fight with its tail. The head begins to fight with its tail until they both die eventually. I don't know if that's a myth, but this is very evocative sort of imagery that he uses, where the more powerful part of the will is turned on itself to devour the smaller part and therefore reduce the fragmentation. So Schopenhauer also manages to cross the Kantian bound between the world and the subject, except Schopenhauer thinks there's no bound really. It's an illusion. The will and the experiencing subject are really one and the same. It's just the illusion of the will, which it has really imposed onto itself, which gives the illusion of there being a bound in the first place. But because there's no real boundary between the world and the subject can often attain a fragmentary glimpse into the world as it truly is, as the will. And this is an important part of developing a method or strategy of subduing and eventually calming the will for Schopenhauer. And he thinks that whereas Kant thought of the world as being consisting of the external things in themselves and the internal world of the phenomena, which is the representation, it's not the things so much as the will that we're perceiving out there in the external world. But ultimately, because they're all the same, it's not even something that is continuous as in touching borders like in Hegel's world. We are part of and inseparable from the will in truth, but our illusions force this fragmentation to persist. And as I said, Schopenhauer was very influential on many great artists and philosophers, and many of those artists and philosophers then influenced Nietzsche. Here's Richard Wagner, who's the greatest composer of his era, and he's very unique in that he was a really well-read philosopher as well as a great artist. Wagner was involved with the left Hegelians, especially the anarchists, and he participated in revolutionary movements in the barricades with the anarchists. He was, I think he was friends with and read Bakunin, and this was in his early days until he was exiled from Germany for some 17 years until he came back in his 50s and then met Nietzsche when Nietzsche was when Nietzsche was about 24. And Wagner was the quintessential artist-philosopher who just brilliantly gifted. Nietzsche modeled much of his own conception of the great heroic individual, which he develops as a concept in his own philosophy on Wagner. He thinks that until he turns away from Wagner and as part of his development, as part of becoming more independent as his own thinker, he models all of his philosophy onto essentially Wagner. He thinks that a philosophy that enables the development of an individual into what he calls the free individual, such as Wagner, is the correct philosophy to develop. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the greatest German writer of all time, as he's considered, the top three alongside Luther and Nietzsche. He was a reader of Schopenhauer. He even read Schopenhauer's very poorly received PhD dissertation, even though it was a complete commercial failure when Schopenhauer tried to publish it. Goethe read it, he really liked it, and he especially admired the parts that Schopenhauer had written about the relation between optics and philosophy. And so there's a really funny kind of anecdote where Goethe wrote to Schopenhauer and invited him to come do philosophy with him or collaborate with him, and Schopenhauer expected to come and do philosophy, but Goethe was obsessed with color theory at the time and made Schopenhauer work on optics with him, because Schopenhauer was a sort of an expert. He was originally medically trained, very scientifically literate, and Goethe was also influential on Nietzsche, as Goethe was on practically all German thinkers and artists following after him. And Goethe is another great model for Nietzsche, as another free spirit, and even more than Wagner, Goethe really was this truly free spirit. He's famous for doing one random great work of art after another just on a whim, and much of this was facilitated by the fact that he was so free in his personality. He truly felt free to pursue whatever his interests were at the time and make things. And he would go on to write one thing that was a big hit, but then turn and do something completely different. He wrote a very melancholic parody of the Romantics, which was not received in the way he wanted. It was an ironic critique of the romantic, over melodramatic young people of the time, where this main character falls in love and then he just messes it up because he's too neurotic to do anything about it and actually pursue his passions. And then he's a real menace. He causes a big worry to everyone around him and then commits suicide. And this was a big hit with the young people, and they began mimicking it. Some even mimicked the suicide part. Goethe was very upset by this, but this is just how it was received. But after he moved on to write what were called closet plays, you read them out loud in a small circle of your friends. You don't watch it on the stage. Very famous, Faust. And then after, everybody's waiting for the sequel to Faust, but he goes and does optics work with Schopenhauer. Free spirit. Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of the greats of American philosophy. He was a poet, he was an essayist, and he was very influenced by Schopenhauer, and especially Schopenhauer's interest in Eastern and Indian philosophy. Ralph Waldo Emerson was also this kind of free spirit. His main thing was about independence, individuality, following your own gut, listening to your own intuitions, especially artistic but creative intuition in general. And he wrote a famous essay, very influential, called Self-Reliance. It's the quintessential American piece of essay. It's all about listening to your own muse, your own intuitions, and your own tastes, and following it through. Otherwise, someone else will do it, but worse, and you'll be very upset because you'll feel like it was something that you should have done, something along those lines. And Nietzsche's very impressed by this kind of individual heroism that Emerson is promoting here, the creative hero again. And so Nietzsche is impressed with Emerson, except for the fact that Emerson becomes a little too religious and metaphysical in his thinking. So Nietzsche thinks, here's someone who could have become just like me, but he fell short because he was corrupted by poor philosophical influences around him. Soren Kierkegaard, this one is very interesting. He's one of, alongside Nietzsche, he's seen as the founder of existentialism. He's one of the two founders, essentially, and he is. He thinks of himself as the new Luther. Whereas Luther was reacting against the Catholic Church and rebelling against the corruption of the Catholic Church, Kierkegaard is reacting against the Danish Lutheran Church. And he writes that there has to have come a new Luther. This new Luther, however, has to arise in a different historical context and has to be a sort of a different person altogether. And he thinks he is the new Luther, and he will bring about the same kind of revolution as the Lutheran and Protestant Reformation, which was the completion of the Occamist and nominalist attack on scholastic theology by Luther. Except Kierkegaard sees himself as attacking the limited and stilted theological practices of the church, the over-institutionalization of religion through the Lutheran Church. And so he's got a very peculiar way of going about doing this. He focuses intensely on the individual subject as the vessel of faith and the protagonist of his own faith. Kierkegaard thinks that there's no way to provide things like a geometric proof that you should believe in God. In fact, all things considered, it seems altogether irrational to believe in God. But Kierkegaard thinks you have to nonetheless attempt to believe in God. This is a very important thing, and you have to make the very important decision to believe in God, which isn't something that you do just once, because it's not a matter of proving to yourself that this is the correct choice. For Kierkegaard, you renew your faith consistently all the time. You're always committing to this irrational act of believing, irrational act of taking what he calls the leap of faith, believing in spite of this being, on the one hand, a very serious decision, but on the other hand, a very irrational and ungrounded sort of decision. And so, drawing from all of these influences, Nietzsche manages to complete his attempt at the completion of Lutheran atheism, which is my name for it. He didn't call it that, but he was very impressed with Luther as well. He very much liked Luther until he began to develop his taste for an anti-Christian rhetoric and generally an anti-Christian Christian philosophy. But one of his earliest role models is still Luther, much like Kierkegaard's role model was Luther, even though Kierkegaard was also influenced by Schopenhauer and had read Hegel too. Whereas Schopenhauer thinks that it's the will that is experiencing itself through the individual subject, Nietzsche reverses the directionality of this subjecthood. It's the subject and the will to power, not the will to survive or will to suffer less, that is driving everything. He thinks that it's the exact opposite kind of affect to Schopenhauer. He still holds on to the notion that the world consists of will nonetheless. So Nietzsche still believes in a Schopenhauerian metaphysic, but, and much like Schopenhauer, he thinks there are many different kinds of wills in the world. For example, he thinks that Kant was great, but he let the will to truth get the best of him, and he became imbalanced, and there was a moral failing on Kant's part. And he thinks that the will to survive, as he calls the Schopenhauerian pessimistic sort of will, is not the will that derives everything. He thinks that things are growing, things are pursuing more power, things are pursuing dominance, things want to become stronger, things want to dominate and oppress and gain an advantage over other things, and that's how everything works in the world. He thinks that the will to power is the most important and significant sort of will. But he's got essentially the same sort of structure as Schopenhauer when he looks at the world. The world still is something that is made up of the will. It's just that the directionality, as far as the Nietzschean subject is concerned, is from the perspective of the will to power, not the perspective of the totality of the wills separated into each other. And so Nietzsche essentially thinks that it's a good thing that the will has been split up and has been fragmented, because Nietzsche thinks that it's through the competition and the drive for dominance between the wills that makes more complex and stronger and more valuable entities to arise. And so this is an important part of his critique of Christianity along the psychological and anthropological lines. Not only is God dead, but Nietzsche claims we still have to overcome his shadow, because even though God is already dead, the structures that have been built on top of the foundation that was provided by the faith in God persists and has a strong hold over humanity and civilization. And so he provides a critique of Christianity in his attempt to provide a way for the future generations reading him to overcome Christianity and see the truth about Christianity as ultimately nihilistic. And this is very particular usage in Nietzsche. Whereas in the previous generations, nihilism was used to describe just vaguely amoral seeming or actions that seem to go against established values. So in the previous generations, nihilism was used as a word to describe things like political terrorists, things like even artistic movements that were critical of conservative morality. It wasn't about the substance of a particular ideology so much as a comparative term. But Nietzsche is saying that Christianity is itself intrinsically nihilistic. And mainly, one important reason that he claims this is that Christianity is a mythology which promotes truth as a supreme value, even whilst being truthful, and therefore intrinsic to Christianity is its own downfall, because as we've seen in Occam and the nominalists and the subsequent generations of theologians attacking the church, attacking the very notion of natural theology and the possibility of understanding God and the world through Christian theology and through a foundation of Christian faith, it's this promotion of truthfulness as a supreme value that is Christianity's own undoing. It's like Kant, who very much had a Christian ethical worldview. He was very much a Christian thinker. There's an overabundance of the will to truth inherent to Christianity. And not only that, but also along psychoanalytic or proto-psychoanalytic lines and anthropological lines. Nietzsche points out that Christianity was the product of an enslaved peoples, and therefore the consequence of their desire to enact revenge onto the oppressors. So Nietzsche argues that Christianity is it's based on an ulterior motive to flip the oppressor's moral worldview onto itself, so that the oppressed people can deny the oppressors at least something that is supposedly promised in the afterlife. And so it's something that is fundamentally negativistic. It's something that is founded on a reaction against the oppressors, to which the worldview can then enact revenge by withholding access to heaven and calling them evil. And Nietzsche thinks that this is the invention of evil as a concept, where it's superimposing the exact opposite of whatever was the predecessor of this moral system, which was the moral system of the elites, the aristocrats, which was positivistic, as in it's something that is substantive. Nietzsche thinks that the elites had a substantive view of ethical worldview, which was primarily self-referential. It's a descriptor of the elites as being good, and whatever else is not the elites is bad, and so that's an afterthought for the elites and the aristocrats. Whereas for the enslaved, oppressed peoples, Nietzsche thinks it's the complete opposite. It's a negativistic thing. It's all about describing what is not you as the bad thing, and whatever is not the oppressors as the good thing, and that's the afterthought for Christians. And Nietzsche thinks that this construction of a negativistic worldview that is also grounded in this view of an all-powerful God who always has a good reason for making anything happen in the world, prohibits the development of new values and new systems of values and new ways of valuing things. Because no matter what happens, God wills it, and therefore, even if you can't understand it, even if it seems incoherent, it's still got a sort of negativistic explanation by the very fact that it's seen as something that humans can't understand, but God can. It makes escaping into a different system of values very difficult. And Nietzsche talks about the aristocratic elites of the ancient era as the warrior class, and he says that as an offshoot and development of the enslaved people's slave morality, as opposed to the master morality of the warrior class, comes the class of the priests. And these priests are the most powerful enemies of the warrior class, which is equivalent in power to the warriors, and also aims to enslave the herd, the regular people whom the warriors seek to oppress physically and enslave through the use of force and war, while the priests attempt to do the same, except through the use of words, through the use of religion, namely through the use of things like Christianity. So the priests are the antithesis of the warriors, but both enslave the herd. And this kind of dichotomy is something that Nietzsche sees as both literal, as in it's something that really did happen in history, in his speculative form of anthropology. And this dichotomy is reflected in his view of the Christians versus the pagans, the Apollonian versus the Dionysians, which is his metaphor about the different modes of experiencing and valuing the world. One is very rationalistic, and the other is very passionate. And the last man and the Übermensch, which is his also speculative prediction of what might happen in the future. The last man is this very passive, inert kind of creature who has no ambitions, very little will to power within him, doesn't strive to do anything with his life, doesn't care about greatness or anything, just some mild pleasure is plenty enough for him. The Übermensch is the opposite. It's the free spirit, as exemplified by figures like Goethe, like Wagner, like Emerson. They're the possible great people of the future who will be so much greater than the people that exist now that compared to them will be just like worms. And Nietzsche thinks that depending on which system of morality comes to continue to dominate in civilization, we will either end up with the last man as the race of people of the future, or the Übermensch. And he of course thinks the Übermensch is the more valuable, and that we should strive to destroy the slave morality of Christianity and promote the master morality of the pagans. And whereas the Christians have their patristic tradition of looking to Jesus as the role model and trying to copy Jesus and follow his way of life as the perhaps the most important methodology of Christian practice, Nietzsche presents himself as the Antichrist, as a role model to follow against Christian worldviews, against the slave morality, as a sort of a reversed Christian role model to follow, and to give way to new ways of living that will bring you closer to becoming a free spirit. So much like Kierkegaard considers himself as the new Luther, and much like Luther considers himself as the true heir to Occam, Nietzsche is saying he's the heir to Luther, except he's inverting it. Very similar to the kind of strategies as employed by both Schopenhauer and Hegel in reaction to Kant, in that the previous generation's thinkers' system is inverted for Nietzsche's own purposes here. And the reason that Nietzsche thinks we can't simply adopt the pagan worldview wholesale is because at the end of the day, the Western civilization is a hybrid civilization, partly made up of the Christian worldview and partly made up of the pagan worldview. And so it's an impure civilization. Its history is the history of the reconciliation of Christian worldview and the pagan worldview, as the scholastics strove to complete. But Nietzsche's point is that the Christian worldview and the Christian value system has come to dominate too greatly, and we need to restore the balance, if not altogether supplant the Christian worldview, because he thinks that otherwise we'll end up with the last man, and that's a terrible thing. We need to go towards the Übermensch, the free spirit. And Dostoevsky, actually, despite being Christian, he really does voice the concern that drives this kind of thinking about the death of God and the persistence of the church institution nonetheless. And also the kind of the trap that Nietzsche points out as being constructed by the priestly class of making the development of new values impossible. Dostoevsky's character in this novel points out that it's impossible for the individual human being to accept and comprehend all the pain and suffering and cruelty in the world just on the grounds that God will reconcile the apparently irreconcilable in the end. He'll justify all the suffering. You'll come to understand why it happened. Here Dostoevsky is describing that this is just something that's emotionally impossible for the human to accept, really. And so Nietzsche's got this triphasic model of the development from the slave morality towards the master morality and perhaps beyond. And he calls it the camel and the lion and the child. The camel represents to Nietzsche the self-negation of God, as in the inherent nihilism of Christianity. But religion initially enables the suffering, the desperate, and the powerless to at least go on persisting, go on living, and to not give up. It's a very primitive mode of being, and Nietzsche, of course, thinks it's a terrible way to be. And the lion represents to Nietzsche the resistance and overcoming of the ordinary values of society. The lion overcomes and defeats the dragon, and the dragon represents the values of things like received wisdom, things like religious orthodoxy, and in this specific instance it's about the negation of Christian morality, which Nietzsche saw even in Schopenhauer as persisting, even whilst Schopenhauer presented a decidedly and thoroughly atheistic program. And so Nietzsche thinks that not only do you have to use Christianity to overcome itself and therefore do away with God, you then have to also do away with morality. So on the one hand, you have to overcome the subordination of your life to a system of values greater than life itself, but also you have to overcome the subordination of life to the project of going against that other system of values. And this happens through the renunciation of this renunciation of the prior system of values. So you can't simply be reacting against the existing system of values. You also have to overcome that reaction and therefore open the way to building up something new. And Nietzsche charts out the path from to the first, the self-negation of God, and then the negation of Christian morality. But he doesn't do the same with the renunciation of anti-theism. For Nietzsche, his era is when this negation of Christian morality happens, but then after that, even this project of the negation has to be overcome. And because Nietzsche's been so heavily reliant on the tools provided by Christianity, namely the promotion of truthfulness as the supreme value, in order to point out the logical and factual inconsistencies inherent to Christianity to overcome it, and also to show that there's no factual grounding in terms of truthfulness in Christian morality itself, he has to somehow attempt to overcome even his continued valuing of truth as an important ideal, because Nietzsche really does still value truth. He's not a relativist about truth. He's not using rhetoric arbitrarily to argue for things he doesn't believe in. He still uses truth as an important tool in his philosophy, but Nietzsche thinks that even this has to be overcome. And this is a project that has to be taken up by people following after Nietzsche. And so that is the end of the talk. And next time we'll look at psychoanalysis.